Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nabil Al-Gururi, and I am the Executive Director of CAMFT. And I'm pleased to have Ben Caldwell of SimplePractice talking about the transition to telehealth. So this is our one of our Lunch and Learn series to support our members. As a reminder, this is not a CE event, but you can earn CEs through CAMFT's on-demand learning library for a variety of recorded sessions on clinical workshops, and you can earn your CEs. Now all the content is free, but the CE credits require a the payment. So we're going to use we have a poll right now for those who are practicing telehealth. How was the transition? Easy peasy, ran into more bumps than I wanted, or Calgon, take me away. And so please give us your answers. We'll give you a couple more minutes. I see we have 274 participants so far watching the video, and a bunch of people probably calling in as well. So we'll give you another minute or 20 seconds to answer that question. We're going to end that in a little bit. And while we're waiting for that, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. I will be using those questions to determine what questions to ask. So use the questions and then use the like button to bump things up. And the questions do need to be relatively specific. Giving best practices in telehealth, I'm not going to be able to. That's too broad. So what we found right now for how was the transition? Easy peasy, 44%. Ran into more bumps than I wanted, 49%. And help, Calgon, take me away, 7%. So, realistically, Ben, what do you think of these numbers?
That sounds like about what I've heard from the folks I've spoken with about the transition. It seems like a pretty even split between people who did it pretty easily and people who had some headaches. Thankfully, it hasn't been a horrible nightmare for a lot of folks. But by and large, it's been, I think, an okay transition. It's just been faster than we all would have hoped, right? I think the average therapist who was sort of considering telehealth wanted a little more time to consider it before being thrown into this all at once.
Hi, this message is, now I'm going to send something for all our listeners. We're almost at 300. If you click gallery view instead of speaker view, then you will see both Ben and myself at the same time. So you can manipulate that. When the video is shared, that will show us in gallery format. So let's see. Reminder, if you don't get your question answered, feel free to call CAMFT if it's a legal or issue or a licensure issue. And CAMFT answered 18,000 questions last year. So if you're a member, you can call and have your questions answered. And if you're not a member, please feel free to join.
Of those 18,000 questions, Nabil, I would guess maybe a solid 20% of them were from me.
I believe it. So do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more, Ben?
Yeah, sure. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ben Caldwell. I am the Education Director for SimplePractice Learning. At SimplePractice, we have a practice management software suite, and we also have a telehealth platform. So we've seen, obviously, tremendously increased utilization in a very short period of time, and it's been really cool to watch. I'm also a licensed MFT myself. I've been practicing here in California for a long time. I specialize in working with couples. And I'm on the faculty as an adjunct faculty member at Cal State University Northridge.
And thank you to SimplePractice for supporting CAMFT as an affinity partner. As a reminder, if you sign up for SimplePractice through CAMFT's affinity partner link, which we will post in the chat, you get 2 free months instead of just the normal 1 free month free trial. So that's a really nice benefit for everyone who's a CAMFT member who signs up for SimplePractice. Okay, we're gonna do a second question just to another poll. And that question coming up in a second. Where have you seen your clients when in a telehealth session? Where the clients have been? Where have the clients been? In a car, in a bathroom, in a closet, all of the above. So in California, backyard is also a possibility, but we had to limit the number of answers. My understanding is that a lot of therapy sessions are occurring in cars, because that's probably the most private place at home right now, and bathrooms. So interesting world we're in. Garage. I see someone saying garage in the chat. Okay, so let's see what the answers are. Car, 72%, bathroom, 8%, closet, 11%, all of the above, 20%. That is great. So we are going to, I'm going to start the questions now. We're going to start with a couple questions broadly to start the conversation. Then we'll go to questions from the Q&A. So the first is, what is telehealth? Start simple.
Well, I think most of us are familiar, at least in broad lines at this point. But one of the things that I would emphasize here is that the way that California defines telehealth, we of course use legalese for a very specific definition here. But ultimately what it comes down to is if you have a provider who's in one place, a client who is in a different place, and you are using technology to provide some kind of a healthcare service, that is telehealth under California law. And the reason why that conceptual framework is important is because phone sessions count as telehealth. That's you in one place, the client someplace else, and the use of technology to deliver a service. And so a lot of us, me included, I think, tend to default to a mental understanding of telehealth that means online kind of video-based sessions. But if you've been doing phone sessions with any kind of frequency at all with your clients before this, you have been a telehealth provider, and you've been bound to all of the telehealth requirements in state law.
And phones is actually a great thing to keep in mind because, as an equity issue, a lot of people don't have internet at home. And so but a lot of people do have cell phones. And so you can still do therapy with clients who don't have internet by doing phone therapy. So let's go then. Our next question is, how has the current crisis impacted the use of telehealth in psychotherapy, in private practice?
Well, we don't have tremendous data on this yet, but we of course have what everyone has been forced to do in terms of the transition to telehealth in most work settings. And we're starting to see some data here and there in terms of utilization, in terms of people's experiences with it. So we do have a ton of therapists who, even though we are considered essential workers because of our role in healthcare, who made the choice for our own safety, for the safety of our clients, to transition entirely to telehealth. And in some cases, as we saw here, that's been an easy transition. In other cases, it's been a difficult transition. It also, from the client perspective, sometimes has been really easy and sometimes has been really difficult. So I've talked with some therapists who have actually grown their practices in the midst of this, partly because they're really confident and comfortable in doing telehealth. And I've also talked with some therapists, especially ones who are sort of more anxious about the transition and might have brought that into their sessions, who have lost half their client base or more. So it's really been a disruption. Obviously, telehealth usage has skyrocketed, and it's a little bit too early to say what that's done in terms of therapeutic effectiveness. Clients, of course, like the comfort and convenience of being able to come to therapy from their own homes, not have to drive anywhere, wait in an office, that kind of thing. And I think we all appreciate the added safety that's involved. But it is certainly a change, and it'll take a while to sort out what the full range of impacts of that change have been.
So go to one last question from our pre-list of questions, and then we're going to go to live Q&A. So what are a few best practices to keep in mind when you're delivering telehealth services?
Well, to start with, I know there's language in our codes of ethics, there's a little bit in state law as well, about the utilization of best practices when providing telehealth. And I think for a long time, people would ask, well, what does that mean exactly? What lists do I go to? Where does this live? And over the past few years, we've seen a number of best practices publications put out by a variety of different mental health organizations. And so the best place to start, if you have questions about best practices, is do some creative Googling. You can find online or telehealth best practices documents from a number of different mental health groups. I chaired the group that did a document like this for CAMFT that you can find for free online, but there's a bunch of other really great ones out there as well. And they tend to go into more detail in a way that at least I've experienced as really useful and not overly restrictive or overly burdensome. So some of it's just about the technical stuff, making sure that you've practiced with the technology before you're using it, etc. If you're doing phone sessions, it is a best practice to verify the identity of the client in some way at the beginning of that phone session. It's a little bit easier on a video session because you can kind of tell based on who you're looking at whether this is the right person or not. On a phone session, sometimes, people might have a family member who answers the phone for them instead. We want to make sure that we're talking to the right person. I knew a therapist a while back who at the beginning of every phone session would ask the client, "What color jacket are you wearing today?" And it didn't matter what the client was actually wearing. They had worked out ahead of time that this was going to be how they would verify identity. And the correct answer to that question was blue. And if the answer was anything other than blue, then the therapist would just hang up and wouldn't proceed any further in the conversation. Now, you don't have to do it that way. There are 1,000 good ways to verify identity, but that's a good example of a best practice.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. Okay, so now I'm going to start asking some questions from our Q&A. So Dana Sunderland asks, I'm really curious how people might be using telehealth with kids age 5 to 12. So what are your thoughts?
What a great question. Awkwardly, I think is the answer in some cases.
Right?
If you've got somebody who is in your office and you've got games and maybe a sand tray and other stuff there to physically engage them, it is much harder to do that online. And it's kids is not really my wheelhouse in terms of my clinical work. I have tremendous respect for those who that is their wheelhouse. When I've been talking with kid therapists about this, I've seen just over the past month groups springing up for online child therapists so that they can exchange resources and exchange what they've found to be really workable. One of the things that I have heard is you may want to go to shorter sessions. Instead of trying to keep a kid engaged with a screen for a 45 or 50-minute session, to cut that down to 20 or 25. And still have engagement with the parents, of course, just like you normally would, but to lower your expectations a little bit in terms of the kid being able to engage in conversation with you when you can't have that sort of shared physical space and be able to really play together in the same way. I also know some folks who have started integrating some of these other online tools, even through, screen share and kind of collaborative play that they can do online. It's that to me is really creative and wonderful. And if it is fostering expression from the kid, I think anything is fantastic.
And as a reminder, in 2 weeks, we're going to have a lunch and learn with Kurt Widholm, who is going to be talking specifically about telehealth with kids. So we're going to have a specific session dedicated topic. Okay, Michelle Janney asks, is verbal consent enough for the transition to teletherapy, or do we still need to obtain a written consent?
What a great question. So the way that California law is, and I wouldn't presume that it's the same in other places, but at least in California, you do not need written consent for telehealth. This is actually something that changed in the law 5 to 10 years ago. Because if you are in an all online practice, it didn't make sense to require written consent. What the law now requires is that you document consent for telehealth. So that means it can be a verbal conversation that you then document. I would imagine the CAMFT lawyers would probably tell you you're a little bit safer to have something that is in writing that the client has signed, even if it's an electronic signature. But what you fundamentally need in accordance with the law is to document that you've done a consent process.
Right. So The next question I have is from Sage Smiley. I'm interested in making sure I'm doing all the right legal and ethical steps for onboarding new clients using telehealth. And by the way, I don't use SimplePractice, so don't hold it
What?
against. That's what was
That's
written in the
okay.
question.
We can still be friends.
So onboarding. What are the steps you need to do for a new client?
Well, so in California law, there are those specific requirements and regulation for the things that you are required to do before beginning telehealth. And I thought this might come up, so I don't have this all top of mind. I have my notes here. Before you start telehealth, you need to, of course, get specific informed consent for a telehealth process that includes informing people of the potential risks and benefits. You need to provide the client with your license or registration information. I would imagine you're probably doing that anyway, just in the normal course of onboarding, but that's a specific requirement for doing telehealth. And you need to document reasonable efforts made to locate crisis resources that are local to the client. That is intentionally stilted language because there are some clients who present higher risk than others. And so you do some assessment, kind of determine what's reasonable in terms of making sure you're aware of the crisis resources that they might need to make use of, and then you gather those resources accordingly. So those are the sort of key steps when it comes to state regulation for telehealth. Obviously, review your CAMFT Code of Ethics. The CAMFT Code of Ethics changed in a meaningful way in December. There was a new edition of the Code of Ethics that was published, and that brings in some additional referencing to technology. But sort of the fundamental things are informed consent, familiarity with technology, security and confidentiality, and so forth. Christy, I see you there. Are you taking
Hi,
over for
I
Nabil?
think Nabil dropped off, so I'm hopping in to kind of continue with the questions. But I think that I really appreciate kind of what you've been saying and the transition. I'm following up with some of the Q&As.
Sure.
And one of the questions that I just saw that came up was that they were asking about any suggestions regarding research or effective approaches for telehealth with play therapy. And I know that we're having that coming up in a upcoming training that you guys can get info on. But do you have any thoughts about that, Ben?
Honestly, I wish that I did. It's a little bit afield from my wheelhouse. I'll be at that
At the training, yeah.
in a couple of weeks, just because I'm really curious myself. I know that there's not a ton of research literature on the topic, but there is some. That research base had been building even before the coronavirus pandemic started. So I'm as curious as you are to learn more about that, and I wish I knew more immediately here.
Yeah, I know that it's a little bit challenging for us to kind of navigate that, but definitely stay posted when we are going to launch that and everybody can tune in. So I think we got Nabil back here.
Yes,
continue.
thank you for continuing, Christy.
Sure.
We have backup plans always, and internet has been unsteady. Actually, let's use that as a question. So how do you bounce back therapeutically when you or your client disconnects from the internet?
So the most important thing there is to have a plan, because absolutely technology is going to fail at some point. So Rich Bischoff is a researcher, I believe, in Nebraska, and he did this great study a few years ago. They spent a ton of grant money to get the technology to have students at the University of Nebraska provide therapy online to residents in, I think it was 3 rural Nebraska counties. And they got these rooms in community centers so that it was a private place that people could go to, but they wouldn't have to drive hours and hours to go see a therapist. And even with all this money they had spent to get brand new equipment and great internet connection, they still found that technology regularly failed. And it's not that anybody's doing anything wrong there. It's sort of the nature of the beast, right? It's the most unreliable part of the chain is each of our individual Wi-Fi connections. So we need to have a plan ahead of time for if we get disconnected, who is responsible for restoring that connection? What happens if a few minutes go by and we can't restore that connection? At what point do we maybe switch over to phone if we've been doing video?
Right.
And if it's, 5 minutes left in the session, at what point do we just kind of bail and say, you know what, we'll pick this up again next week? You need to have a plan in place so that neither you nor the client freaks out when that happens. And if you disconnect, like it happens to Nabil here, you reconnect and you carry on with the conversation and make sure that it's clear in your body, in your voice, and how you are carrying on. That was no big deal. That was a hiccup. Let's keep going.
Yeah, life happens.
Yeah.
Another idea could be texting. Just quickly say, hey, it was my connection that got disconnected. I'm trying,
Yeah.
And that's even that study is in the best of circumstances, not when everyone's downloading the latest Tiger King.
Right.
So there's a couple questions about out of state, and let's answer one of them. So if my client is sheltering in place out of state, a student or a young person or anyone who goes to family or wherever in Nevada, back in New York, wherever, what are the issues about seeing that client? I'm licensed here in California, they're in another state.
So we have a balance here, right? Between there's the ethical requirement for non-abandonment, for continuity of care, making sure that we're addressing crisis issues appropriately. And there is the legal issue of state lines and the fact that your license really only authorizes you to practice with clients who are physically located inside the jurisdictions where you are physically licensed. In the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, there are a number of states that have loosened their restrictions when it comes to out-of-state care.
Right.
There was a great article in The Atlantic about this, sort of making the argument that if we're able to loosen those restrictions in the middle of a pandemic and we're not too worried about safety issues, maybe we didn't need some of those restrictions in the first place. But not every state has loosened their restrictions on out-of-state care. There were, I think last I knew, there were 9 states that had their own little sort of carve-outs prior to all this for temporary care from an out-of-state licensee. So you need to understand what the rules are where the client is physically located at the time of service. The CAMFT Code of Ethics, as well as state law, have used that word located very specifically. California does not care about residency. They care about where the client's body physically is when you are working with them. When it comes to other states, most states see it the same way, but not necessarily all of them do. So the legal risk is that you might be seen as providing therapy without a license when somebody is in that other state. It's not high risk, and certainly in the midst of current circumstances, there is a strong argument to be made for providing continuity of care and protecting safety and all that. But as a technical legal question, and of course I'm not a lawyer and I'll happily defer to the CAMFT lawyers on this, as a technical legal question, you may be bound to the rules of that state where the client is physically located at the time of service.
I mean, always verify with the other state. And CAMFT we posted a link in the chat, and for listeners on the webinar online, you can find that on the CAMFT website, the main page, go to the COVID-19 FAQ page, and in there is a list to the regulatory board with all the links for all the regulatory bodies of every state. And frankly, I anticipate at the end of all this, some legislation discussing telehealth. I think telehealth is going to be a lot more common and a lot easier to do. I see legislation to fix that, as well as work with insurance companies to do that. So part of the issue is insurance companies also were not paying necessarily for telehealth.
Oh, even now, in the midst of all this, as there has been legislation and executive action intended to force those reluctant insurers to provide coverage for telehealth services at a parity level, I still hear anecdotally about various shenanigans that insurance companies have pulled here and there to try to avoid reimbursing. So yeah, that's a critical component here.
Here's a question. How well has telehealth worked for couples therapy?
Oh my goodness, that is a great question. And in the work I did for AMFT on some of the best practices stuff, we dove into the literature, and one of the things that we found was that there was effectively zero outcome research on online therapy with couples and families. So we made the recommendation, if you're working with couples or families online, it probably would be a good idea to frame that as an experimental form of treatment. We just have no data one way or another. I will tell you, just from where I sit, and again, my specialty has been working with couples. A lot of what I do in the therapy room is, if I've got a couple who is arguing, getting heated, and I want to kind of calm them down, I will move my chair. I'll put a hand up and kind of move closer to one person just to say, it's okay, let me bring you back, talk to me. It is much harder to do that. It's much harder to interrupt an interaction cycle online than it is in person.
Yeah.
And so the couple and family therapy friends I have really been wrestling with this, and it's impacted their decisions about whether and when to go back into the physical office. So we don't have great data. Anecdotally, it adds challenges for sure.
Okay. And the question that everyone's asking about, I'm going to raise it here to get your opinion on it. When do you think we can go back into the office? What do we need to do that?
Wow. How long do you have? I mean, I think the short and a little bit pat answer is we wait for guidance from public health authorities.
Yep.
That being said, different cities and counties are moving at different rates here, I think appropriately so. Some of this has to be an individual decision based on the risk level of the clients with whom you work, and even your physical office. I know some therapists who are in physical offices where during session, there's no way you're maintaining 6 feet of social distance.
That is common in LA, in urban areas, like the downtowns. You have tiny offices. That is a very real issue.
Absolutely. And so you consider the risk factors in terms of you and your own health. If you're in a vulnerable population, your clients, what kinds of protections can you actually have in place in your office? Are you able to stagger appointments such that you maybe add an additional 15 or 30 minutes in between sessions so that you can clean and sanitize? What's happening in the rest of your building? All these things are appropriate considerations such that we've got sort of the community-wide guidance, which I would certainly listen to first and foremost. And then even if your community is allowing you to return to work, I would be thinking through how comfortable I am with the decision to return to work and kind of weighing that against the benefit for my clients. I think it needs to be an individual kind of decision. It needs to be intentional, and you ought to be documenting that decision-making process. I know that APA has put a couple of documents online that I think are really helpful. One was, it's not a waiver, but it's kind of an additional informed consent document that you might want to share with clients as you are making the transition back into the physical office.
They have a list of questions too, and CAMFT has some thoughts as well. Look on the COVID-19 page. So we're going to do one last question, and then we're almost at 12:30. So we're going to do one last question. And this is a question that I got from the questions people submitted before. What are some of the effective and creative techniques that are needed and helpful to build rapport, to support our clients emotionally, socially, culturally through telehealth? Because it's very different than some of the things we do in live sessions.
It is different, and I appreciate that question a lot. I think it's one of the things that all of us as clinicians are kind of wrestling with. If you're somebody who would typically offer clients a handshake or a pat on the back, if depending on kind of the nature of your work, who you're working with, if you would even hug clients now and again, like we're not doing that right now. So how do we build bonds in a comparable way? And while I would be the first to acknowledge it just isn't the same as that kind of physical touch and the impact of physical touch in a really positive way. I've tried to make a real point of differentiating a therapy session from a business meeting. And what I mean by that is, in a business meeting, there's a tendency to, once everybody is on, to get right to work. And in therapy, you know, normally that first couple of minutes of session, you might, whether purposefully or not, have developed these rituals about how therapy begins, kind of the settling
Yeah.
in process. You know, do you offer somebody a cup of coffee or tea or water? Do you comment on what they happen to be carrying with them that day, or kind of how they look? You know,
How was the traffic?
yeah,
How was the
how was the traffic? So I think it's actually worth making time for that kind of small talk. And even if you're seeing into somebody's home, comment on the fake tree that you see behind me, or the things that you see on the wall behind Nabil. Like, those are things that can be a good sort of soft entryway for discussion, that feels like it's socially bonding, that it's not the hard work of therapy, but it is the work of relationship building. I try to do a couple of minutes for that at the beginning of every session and at the end of every session as well, so that it's not just the work of therapy, it really is a therapeutic relationship.
You're saying it's okay to not do exposure therapy from second one in a therapy session? I don't
I
understand.
mean, you could.
I mean, you know, thing. I think you made a great point, which is that social, the chit chat at the beginning, it does serve a purpose, a therapeutic purpose,
Absolutely.
rapport, and then occasionally there's a, or maybe more than occasionally, there's a tidbit that is really valuable that you need to dive into.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes the focus of your session, not necessarily the plan that you had before they walked in the door.
Exactly
So,
right.
so make time for some of those rituals. You know, the hard part is, I think it's making all of us much more cognizant of what we do. We now have to be a lot more intentional
Mm-hmm.
in our approach to therapy, because, you know, when you've been doing it in person for years, you can be on sort of autopilot.
Totally.
And now you have to think, how do I introduce, how do I build rapport? You know, clients
I'll
want
tell
to look
you,
away at times.
yeah, one of the things that I guess two things I've tried to be much more conscious about. One is eye contact. I mean, there is that thing of, and I think cameras are getting better about this, but you know, if you're looking down at your screen, it can look to the client like you're not looking at them. So I try to be intentional about
Right.
positioning the window sort of close to the camera, so that when I can look at the window and still look like I'm looking at the client. The other
I'm
thing that
looking at
I've
you on
gotten,
camera right now, and how does it look? It looks like I'm
yeah,
not
it looks
looking at.
like you're looking off to the side a little bit.
Right.
Yeah, and so the other thing I've tried to be more intentional about is my voice, because there are things that we do sort of subconsciously with our bodies in session, where we maybe slump over a little bit, or you know, our just our posture, our other stuff about our movement changes in a way that impacts the room. And since it's different online, since I'm still a flat screen to my client, I've tried to be a little more purposefully theatrical in my voice, and being really like happy and hypomanic when I'm happy for the person on the other end of that connection. And also to be very intentionally soft and slow in those moments in therapy that are heavier and require that kind of energy. I think we all do that a little bit naturally, but I've tried to dial that up a little bit since we've been in the midst of all this, because it's an effort to communicate some of those things that I would normally communicate with a combination of my voice and my body.
So I want to thank you, Ben, for joining us today, and SimplePractice for being an affinity partner. As a reminder to those attending right now, if you join SimplePractice through CAMFT's affinity partnership page, and our link is in the chat, that you can get 2 months instead of 1 free month when you sign up. So it's a great way to test out a new product and use a practice management system as well as a telehealth platform. And so we have a couple more lunch and learns coming very soon. We have, we have one on telehealth and kids. We have self-care, and then we have one on pre-licensees. The pre-licensee one will be with Robin Anderson of prelicensed.com, as well as from Track Your Hours.
I'm a fan of hers. That'll be a good one too.
So we've got a lot of stuff for you. And this will be posted online. Give us a week or so to get it up. But once again, thank you, Ben. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nabil. Thank you, everybody at CAMFT, and thank you, everybody, for attending. This has been a pleasure. I hope you all stay safe and stay healthy.
Yes. Stay safe, stay healthy. Okay. Take it easy, folks.